Welcome to day 2 of the Purposeful Sequencing Blueprint. Today I'm going to share with you a very simple but incredibly effective tool that I use in my sequencing and that I have taught and shared with many other yoga teachers that I've had the pleasure of mentoring. And this is a tool that adds so much variety, but without you having to go through a lot of those things that I mentioned yesterday, which is feeling like you've got to tick all the boxes and like get every part of the body met, every need met in that one class, which is impossible. We talked about shiny object syndrome and how we kind of look at these different things and go, oh, maybe I'll try that, maybe I'll try that, maybe I'll try that. So this is a tool that you can utilize today that is allowing you to continue to sequence with purpose while adding variety into your classes. Now, what I'm going to share with you is also super beneficial for your confidence as a teacher and the way that you're able to offer expansive, invitational, accessible, and very purposeful classes for your students. This tool actually really helps to break down layers of asana into different components, different actions, different angles, different shapes of the body that adds so much variety and is very invitational, and it also works to totally demystify complex asana. So let me get right to it. The tool that I like to use for this purposeful sequencing blueprint that helps you do all of these things is just simply looking at one pose and breaking down all the layers of that pose. What is involved with that pose? What sort of movements? What sort of actions? Where is the body required to be a little bit more open? Where is the body required to be a little bit more stable and strong? Is there movement? Is there stillness? What type of rotation is happening in the body? What type of shapes and angles, and all of these things. Now you can take one pose, and I have done this many times, one pose, and I have centered the entire class around that particular pose without actually ever having to do that pose. That's one option. And then on the other option, I have utilized that one pose to create a whole entire sequence with lots of variety that does include various areas of the body to then lead into that one particular pose. So you can use this as a way to create a peak pose, and you can also use this as a way to not work towards the peak pose necessarily, but just add variety. Now, the final component to this is that you can do this with many different asanas that you are going to be presenting to your students in your sequence, and this really makes asana practice so much more accessible, and therefore it optimizes the benefits for your students. And I'm not just talking about accessibility for someone who feels like they can't do a pose in a very standardized particular way. I'm talking about making asana accessible also through the lens of focused, purposeful preparation and invitation. Even for those people that can just bust out a particular move. Still, it is very important for them and their bodies to have that invitational process and sequencing and preparation to be able to approach any particular poses, especially ones that demand a little bit more of their bodies. So I'd love to give you a few examples of this. Let's look at tree pose, for example. We might not think that there's too much involved with tree pose, but when we go and we scan the body and we look at head to toe what's happening, you've obviously got, let's start down at the bottom, a balance. So you've got the feet, you've got the toes, you've got the ankle. That in itself gives so much variety to be focused on in your sequencing. Work on different exercises and poses that help stability, that help balance, that help ankle mobility, that work the toes and the feet. When you look at things in this way, all of a sudden you start to add so much more variety and flavor into your classes, but it's not through the lens of needing to entertain your students. It's through the lens of purposeful preparation and invitation. So that's just the lower half. That's just the foot, the ankle. Then we've got that whole standing leg. We've got the stability of that whole standing leg and the hip as well connected onto that leg in order to support the body in that balancing pose. Then we've got the leg that is up against the standing leg in whatever type of tree position you're working, and that's the external rotation of that hip. So you can then add in different exercises that will help the external rotation of that hip. Then we've got the strength and the stability through the upper body, the lengthening of the spine. You've got a little bit of core work going on. Depending on what sort of tree pose variation you might be guiding or encouraging or your students are wanting to explore, you've got different arm positions as well. So then you've got some shoulder things that you can focus on. So you can see how just from that one single pose, we've been able to add a heap of variety within the way that we purposefully sequence our classes. And that's just one pose. And that's why with this type of purposeful sequencing blueprint, I feel that it is not super purposeful to try to tick all the boxes, as I had mentioned in yesterday's video, to try to target every single area of the body, because when we approach asana in this way, we break it down, we break down the layers, we break down all these different things, and then we focus on each part of the body in that way. We create invitation for our students to be able to gradually, progressively open and prepare the body. And in doing so, it doesn't become super necessary or very purposeful to try to, in every class, get every single part of the body aimed at. Now, I'm not saying to never teach a class where you are intentionally, purposefully trying to get every single area of the body, but just with the degree of angles and movement styles and different ways that the body can move, it is virtually impossible to do all of that in one class. So you can then use this type of approach, as I said, for focusing, hyper-focusing on particular areas, movements, angles, shapes of the body, actions of the body, or you can pick, let's say, 5 or more poses that you feel like really do target the whole body. And then each of those poses are broken down into other poses, other movements. It does just not have to only be asana, right? Other little movements that will support the body in eventually getting to and practicing that asana. So we're preparing, we're purposefully preparing and inviting the body in, and this really creates a much more accessible and optimal and sustainable approach to asana for your students, and it helps you feel a lot more confident in offering them a sequence that's purposeful and progressive as well. I'd love to break down one more pose for you, one more example, and that is dancer's pose. There is so much going on in dancer's pose. We've got, again, the balance. So like I mentioned with tree pose before, where you've got the foot, you've got the toes, you've got the ankle, you've got the standing leg. Now on top of that, dancer's pose is a balance combined with a backward bend combined with a hamstring stretch and a spine twist at the same time. So there's a lot going on that we can use to prepare. We're not just throwing this in and not actually allowing our students to experience these types of movements prior to getting into that pose. We're exposing their bodies and purposefully bringing them into positions that will help the body approach a dancer's pose in a way that is highly optimal. And again, they're prepared for that. So again, you've got that standing leg, you've got the foot, you've got the hamstring of the standing leg. Then you've got the front body opening as the kick happens. You've also got the strength through the back body that's required. You've got the shoulder opening as the arm reaches back. And then you've got the spine twist on top of that. So you can take that pose and you can break it down and you can literally do a whole bunch of movements to add amazing variety and flavor into your classes in a way that is very purposeful for your students to connect with themselves in order to prepare for that pose. Now, before we finish today's video, I want to speak quickly to sequencing a pose and using this type of method that I've given you with a pose that is not so complex. Let's just look at something like child's pose. Still, there are so many layers when you look at from the toes all the way through to the fingertips. We've got that fold, the bum to the heels, so we can also utilize that in some capacity. Maybe we're encouraging our students to draw the bum closer towards the heels in a child's pose. It really depends what the purpose is, but this is why you need to come back to your why. Why am I putting this in my sequence? What is the purpose of it? What is it that I am trying to achieve within my sequencing to support my students more? And when you ask those why questions of yourself, then you see that there's so much variety in even something like a child's pose, where it has the most simple components in comparison to something like a dancer's pose. So we've got that lower half of the body in child's pose. We've got the fold, the bend of the knees, the compression with the thighs against the belly. You've got the body coming forward. Maybe there's a stretch through the back of the body. Maybe the focus is on, the stretch through the shoulders. Maybe it's on creating mobility in the neck and moving the head around during a child's pose. So there are so many different ways that we can look at one pose and we can add an immense amount of variety and purpose to our sequencing by just simply taking components and elements of that pose and then breaking it down and offering it to our students in various ways. Now, this is what I'm going to get into in tomorrow's video in a lot more detail for you, which is some incredibly helpful tips and tools as to how you can break down the layers and then present them with variety to your students. So make sure you tune in to tomorrow's video. I really look forward to seeing you there.